This is a Parshat podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to the Matan Podcast, where this year we're exploring the weekly Haftorah portion. This week's podcast is sponsored by Rabbi Michael and Jerry Laxmeter for the refuah shlema of their granddaughter Abigail Sarah Batshena Arona. For those of you who listen weekly, sponsoring an episode can be a great way to honor a memory, a friend, and even mark a momentous occasion. For more information, contact me at podcast@matan.org.il or the Matan office. I'm also thrilled to tell you about Matan's upcoming Kitvuni conference. Will be taking place on March 8th in New York City. It's going to be called Telling the Story, Writing, Teaching, and Sharing Our Legacy. Be'ezrat Hashem, I will be there along with many of the Matan staff, and it's going to be a wonderful day which both marks and honors all of the Kitvuni books that have been put out by the Kitvuni Fellowship and also will serve as preparation for the upcoming Pesach holiday. Parshat Bo opens with the final three plagues, locust, darkness, and the death of the firstborns, and includes all the formative instructions for the moments of Exodus, the Pesach sacrifice, the redemption of the animal and human firstborn, and how these mitzvot intertwine with the plague of the firstborn. In many ways, the plagues are really 9+1, wherein the final one is performed by God himself and has a particularly tragic element to it. This will finally cinch the ability to leave Egypt, giving us the sense that the 9 plagues that preceded were really a build-up to this final moment. The parasha is unusually occupied with setting the tone for how Pesach will be remembered in the future. It spends less time recording the events as they happen and much more detailing how they should be commemorated in the future and in the future of Am Yisrael. This week's Haftorah is another prophecy of doom against Egypt. While last week was a prophecy spoken by Yechezkel, this week it's narrated in the voice of Yirmiyahu. The prophecy announces God's judgment on Egypt, focusing on its crushing defeat by Babylon at the Battle of Kalgamish. The chapter concludes with reassurance to Israel that although they will experience discipline and exile, God will not destroy them completely and will ultimately preserve and restore the nation. To unpack this prophecy, I'm thrilled to be sitting here with Professor Tova Ganzel. Hi, Tova.
Good morning.
Tova Ganzel is an associate professor in the multidisciplinary department of Jewish studies and serves as the head of Olamot, the School of Jewish and Israeli Culture at Bar-Ilan University. Within the multidisciplinary department, she founded Kramim Honors Program in Jewish Studies. Her research focuses on the Hebrew Bible within the broader context of the Asian Near Eastern world, with special emphasis on prophetic literature and temple-centered communities. Okay, Tova, I'm so happy to be sitting here with you. We last met, I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago, where we did an episode on Parshat Vayikra. You don't remember that. I see, you don't remember. But I'm really happy to be sitting here with you, surrounding one of the Nevi'im, which are books that you speak so beautifully, importantly, and scholarly about in a way that I think that the broader audience really can appreciate. So before jumping into the prophecy itself, which as I already described, there's a certain repetitive element. We're going to speak about how I think it's really not repetitive, but a certain element that at least in its genre is repetitive from last week. Let's just start with a little bit speaking about the figure of Yirmiyahu. Tremendous book, one of our main books of classical prophecy. We can't summarize everything about it, but sort of if you had to characterize him and the maybe the main strokes of his prophecy, what would you say?
When I think of Yirmiyahu, I think of the prophet that was with the Jews, or I should say the Judeans, because the Israelites were already exiled 150 years earlier, or much earlier, in the last days of Jerusalem's survival and right before it fell. It means that we have a prophet that was not only battered, bashed, had to struggle with the nation, but he had to also see around Jerusalem's fall. He was crying with them. He saw the people starving. He saw the temple being burned. He was exiled. And I think that really frames the way he speaks to the people. You can hear a prophet hugging the people, loving the people, suffering with the people. It's like we say about the different prophetic literatures that they have different characteristics. I would say this is like a nevot nechama. It's really more like a condolence. And then when he talks about the future, he really feels what was broken. And if that seems obvious or trivial, then I think the obvious comparison would be to Yechezkel and Yirmiyahu. When we look at Yechezkel, which you saw last week, we look at a prophet who exiled 12 years before the temple was destroyed. Mm-hmm. That means that he wasn't there in Jerusalem when things were getting as worse as they were at the end. He wasn't there when there was a siege in the city and people were really starving, and he wasn't there when the feeling was, where's God? Where's God? Why isn't he saving this temple? We're waiting for him to come around the corner. And that plays out in his prophecies. In Ezekiel's prophecies, we don't see any mercy. We don't see any love. We don't see the same hug that we see in Jeremiah. We see something that's much more harsh. The vocabulary Ezekiel uses is very dim. Baruch once wrote an article on Ezekiel calling the dim view of restoration, going through the different prophecies and basically saying that every time we expect to hear something that's a little bit more comforting, the prophecy says something like, but you never did any tshuva, and therefore the only reason I'm going to now bring you back to the land of Israel is because we have this covenant and I'm obligated to it. That's not the same kind of language Yirmiyahu uses at all. The famous prophecy of Yirmiyahu, Min'i kolech mi bechi ve'enaich mi dim'a, talking about Rachel, which was very popular now that we were all waiting for hostages to come back. V'shavu banim mi gvulam could have never been said by Ezekiel. That's just not his wording. That's not his language. I guess you have to be distant from the events in order to come so hard out on the nation. And I call Ezekiel's prophecies restoration. I don't think they have any comfort. No nechama, more tkuma. And if we have to kind of fill that in, I would say that the last 26 chapters in Yeshayahu, what we call Yeshayahu or Menachem, from chapter 40 to 66, has something much more of retribution, much more of Geulah, the salvation, really the waiting for the temple to be centered, waiting for all the nations to recognize God because the Jewish nation is so amazing, waiting for the temple to be a centered place that people come from all around the world, Jews and non-Jews, and recognize it. That doesn't exist not in Yirmiyahu, not in Yechezkel. That can only exist in a prophet that's far, very distant, not in Israel, not in Babylonia, in a totally different century, looking ahead and asking himself, what are we looking for in the future generations? What would be the utopian vision of a future temple? So we really have three prophets that have three totally different voices about what the future of Am Yisrael will look like after the first temple is destroyed. And if you ask me, that's part of the beautiful, I think, parts of the Tanakh, that it's never about one story. It's different perspectives, that bringing them together gives us alternatives for different situations where we are as a nation and what we're looking for and what we would want to hear. And when things seem things like, wow, we're going in the right way, buildings are being built in this country and things are being planted, and here Israel's coming back to their land, you can really see Ezekiel 36 and you can see the prophecies of Ezekiel's restoration coming up. But then in different times when you feel like nothing here is really happening and maybe it seems like we're not going anywhere, then you have these prophecies of Isaiah that says there will be an utopian day where things will look totally different. And it's just not the same language and it's not the same way to look at the future.
I think that last piece you just said answers a question that was sort of coming up in me as you spoke, because I kind of wanted to ask the thing I always tell my students not to ask, which is this question about, so which is more accurate, which is always just not a relevant question when it comes to a lot of biblical studies. But I think that piece at the end is powerful for me, because even when a reality will come into play, three people will look at that reality very differently. So, even if Yechezkel, Yirmiyahu, and Yeshayahu, not in that order, were all here in a moment now of restoration, they probably would all describe the current moment differently as well. So I think that piece is really important, and we tend to look at the diversity of ideas or the diversity of ways of looking at reality, and we tend to bemoan that. And I think that's usually wrong. Meaning, there's always going to be a lot of different centers, and people are going to look at things very, very differently. And I think that the biblical example is really important.
I would just add one piece to it, that it also depends where you start the story from.
Yeah.
Meaning, let's say if you were going to ask what happened in Israel in the past 2 years, then the question whether you were starting from 48 and describing what happened in October 7th here 2 years ago. If you look at it from the day that the country was first institutionalized and we had Megillat Ha'atzmaut, you'll be telling a different story than if you'll say what happened from the last elections, or if you want to say what happened from the day you started preparing for the holidays or the high holidays 2 years ago and 2 months ago. So it would just be a different story because your perspective would be different. And I think since we always read one specific chapter, we don't always remember that the prophecies are in some kind of continuum. So let's talk about Jeremiah for a minute. He's sitting there, and he's starting to talk in the days of Yoshiyahu, where we're going to be right around the corner looking at the best days maybe in Yehuda and then the worst days in Yehuda. So the story has this, I would say, context where it's like in Hebrew, in Aramaic, we say, we're going from a very high place to a very low place. So we have to understand that context. Yeah. Whereas in Ezekiel is looking at a story that really takes place after the fall of the temple. And everything he's saying about what's happening before is just like to describe this introduction to what'll be later. So obviously, he's not describing the events of what'll happen before, even if you're talking about the same people, like even if you're talking about the same time period, the Jews listening to a prophecy about Egypt, they have two different Egypts in mind. Jeremiah is looking at an Egypt now that the people in Judah are looking like and saying, why are they succeeding when we're not? Yeah. What do they have going for them that we don't? And
meaning they're still a very relevant force.
Obviously, yeah. And in Ezekiel, they're looking at an Egypt where they're asking, what happens to them theologically? Why is their king still in action? Why is their king reacting differently when he wants to save his Ye'ol, when he wants to save his river, when he wants to save his temple, when he wants to save his people? What's with our God that he can't save us? He can't do these same miracles that the Egyptian God does for them? It's just a different conversation about Egypt.
Okay, it's so important, and I really appreciate that. And before we jump deeper into the actual prophecy, I kind of just want you to weigh in also on this question about Nevuot Lagoyim. Okay, this question, we spoke about this a little bit last week in our conversation with Dr. Yael Ziegler, but this idea that we have in our three major prophets, and not only, also in plenty of the Trei Asar, we have these units of prophecies that are spoken about, doom prophecies that are spoken about the other nations. And we mentioned a whole bunch of different perspectives on how we might look at them, why they're included in the Tanakh, why they're important for us to see. So I'm just also curious what your opinion is on that topic.
So first of all, I think the Nevuot Lagoyim are totally all meant for Am Yisrael, meaning they're not Nevuot Lagoyim in the sense that they are Lagoyim, but they're more Al Hagoyim. They're more about the
They weren't spoken
nations.
to them, but they're for internal use.
This is not to say that it can't be that some of the Babylonians weren't exposed to Ezekiel's messages in Ezekiel when he was talking, and that would be the answer why in all of Ezekiel's prophecies to the nations we don't find Nevuah against the Babylons, because you never know if they're just listening there around the corner, because they would be the most obvious nation for Ezekiel to speak against. So excuse me, where are you?
Yeah.
But assuming that Nevuot Lagoyim are really Nevuot to Am Yisrael, I think that explains different things. If you're talking about Ezekiel last week, I'll just say then in the Ezekiel prophecy, it's obvious that the king of Babylon is really Shliach Hashem. He's really the messenger of God, which is another reason maybe why there isn't a prophecy against Babylon. Not only to say they might have been eavesdropping, but also to say that it really means what's God's position in the history now. But when we speak about Jeremiah, there's a different question, I think, that rises very strongly about these Nevuot Lagoyim, and this is their exact timing. What do I mean to say? I mean that even if we look at this week's Haftorah and we look at a prophecy against Egypt, the question whether this prophecy was said in the year that there was this battle between Egypt and Ashur against Babylon, and whether this happened right before the battle or right after the battle, I would say gives a whole different intuition in how to read the prophecy. Meaning, having said that these prophets are really meant to Am Yisrael, then we can either look at them as being said a minute before this battle took place in a very, very cynical voice, saying, hey, you're going to see the Egypts. They are coming to war. They think they're very strong. Let's see how they're preparing for war. And then the God's message would be, but they're all going to fall. Don't get your hopes up. Or don't think you can count on them. So the perception that we have in the Nevuah is very different if we say it took place a minute before the war started, which would mean that the prophet's really a little cynical, or maybe he's kind of pushing to the edge and saying, yeah, it looks like the Egyptians are very strong, and here the prophecy describes in detail how every single one of the soldiers is well prepared and how capable they are and how many horses they have. And we can talk about horses in Egypt for a long time. But and all this detail about how the war is going to supposedly show the strength of Egypt, but really they're all going to fall and they're going to lose this battle and you can't count on them. That would be one perception. But if he was talking to the nation right after the battle happened, it would be kind of looking at them saying, look, you saw this battle. They seem to be well prepared. They seem to be in a place where they would maybe even overcome the Babylons. But really what happened is that they totally fell and they didn't succeed, and you may as well now understand that time has come to really give in and just understand that it's the king of Babylon that'll be ruling the world. So it's two questions. Question one is, who are these prophecies aimed to? And I would say it's Am Yisrael, it's us. Mm-hmm. And the second question is, when were they said? And it's very, very, I would say, tricky when we read Nevuot. Even in this case, which is a very extreme example, we have a specific date.
That's what I just wanted to. I wanted to jut in and say that, because the prophecy, not in the Haftorah, but a few psukim before, in Pasuk Bet, it opens with the timing. But you're making a very important point. It opens. It says, "Lemitzrayim al chel Paro." It's in Pasuk Bet. "Lemitzrayim al chel Paro necho melech Mitzrayim." Meaning they identify which Paro, like as opposed to last week's Haftorah where it just said Paro and not which one. אשר היה נהר פרת בחר כמיש, אשר היכה נבוכדנצר מלך בבל בשנת הרביעית ליהויקים בן יאשיהו מלך יהודה. So it tells you that we're in this year, okay, in the year where we're at this battle, which is the defeat of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in the 4th year of King Yoakim. It doesn't tell us, though, as you're saying so importantly, if it was said before or after. It just tells us it was said in that year. So you're given a date and you think as if it's something that's exact, but your point is really strong. I just want to make sure our listeners understand that, because the date doesn't let us know when it's being said in that 4th year.
So I really think that that's the biggest mystery or question that I have when I study prophecies. Meaning the question of, since I like to contextualize prophecies in their historical context, then it's sometimes we don't have any date. Like we kind of are clueless about when was this said.
In most of Yirmiyahu, we have a lot of question marks.
Right. And sometimes the questions are even bigger, like all the chapters at the end of Yeshayahu were in an even larger question mark. But sometimes there is a date, and then there are two questions. One is we just discussed, which was this right before or right after, which will imply if this was kind of a warning, don't listen to them, or if this was just describing now that this happened, now let's learn from it. And sometimes, like in this chapter where the Haftarah really has two additional components about Egypt. Now we know that prophecies are many times put together thematically. So it would make sense for us to be reading all these nivuot on Egypt. But what we really have is exactly like you said, an introduction that gives us a general year. And then we have the place where our Haftarah starts, הדבר אשר דיבר השם אל ירמיהו הנביא, לבוא נבוכדנצר מלך בבל להכות את מצרים, which would be the things that God told Jeremiah when Nebuchadnezzar came to hit Babylon. And again, even here we don't know if this is right before or right after. And then I would even argue that in verse 20, Yigla Yefeifiya, Mitzrayim, we have another additional prophecy towards Egypt that can be the same year or maybe not the same year, and the tone here changes a little bit. And then finally in verse 27, which is end of the Haftarah, V'ata al tira avdi Yaakov, and then we have this constellation, which is very, very popular among the Nevuot to finish in a positive stream of thought. And these specific two verses actually show up in a different place in Yirmiyahu also. So it's obvious that their context could be, in many different occasions, and it's a condolence framing of the prophecy. So we end up kind of hearing the love of God, and we don't fear from what the future has. And if I'll just take up on what I said before, then a verse like Al tira avdi Yaakov ve'al techat Yisrael would never show up in Ezekiel.
Right. Don't fear my servant Yaakov, and don't be fearful, Am Yisrael.
Yeah. And Shuvah, and those are words of Yirmiyahu. You can wake me up in the middle of the night, read the verse. You don't have to know which prophet it was. All you have to hear is the tone and the voice, and you can tell who's talking.
I just want to say that emphasis it's so important also for our listeners to hear the idea that Yirmiyahu has a softness and has a comfort to him that Yechezkel doesn't. I think is particularly sad, but obviously might contribute to the fact that he was so beaten by everybody, meaning Dafka, he had a softer side to him. And we see that they just really, for all these different reasons, didn't appreciate him. He spoke messages that no one else did. They really thought he was the false prophet, not the actual false prophets. Only in retrospect do we understand that Yirmiyahu was really the one who was correct. But it's sad, it's tragic, whatever word is correct here, but that he was the one who was Dafka Amash with Am Yisrael in his tzara, and was able to, even in that moment, have words of comfort to say, but they weren't words that people wanted to hear.
I think that this chapter is really an extremely, extremely important turning point, exactly in what you're saying. Why is that? Because 605 was such a major year. This was ended
the
up
year
being
of this battle.
This battle ended up being a turning point for Am Yisrael. I would argue that if Galut Yoachin in 597 and the burning of the temple in 586 didn't become so dramatic right around the corner, this would be a year we would all remember. And why so? Until 605, until the Babylonians ruled, all the false prophets had a case. And Yirmiyahu had a much harder time saying that it was the king of Babylon that will take over, and that the destruction of the temple is right around the corner, and it's really going to be destroyed, even though it wasn't destroyed in 701 when the Assyrians and Sennacherib time came up until the gate of Jerusalem, but the last minute it was saved. And we know that, unfortunately, until the last minute, Yirmiyahu didn't convince the people, and they were always waiting, even when they were starving, and even when it seemed against all odds that God would come from in a miraculous way, and he wouldn't let such chilul Hashem happen. He wouldn't let his name be bashed by all the nations just by the fact that God couldn't even save his own people or his own temple. But up until 605, when the people looked around, the reality was with the Nevi'ei Shekel.
Yeah,
meaning there was no real reason to kind of go with Yirmiyahu. So this year, which becomes such a turning point because the minute the Babylons really succeed the battle against, now if you can imagine like a map, then what we have is we have on our left side, on the south side, we have Egypt, which has been there and that all the years, and then we have Judah, and then we have a little bit north, we had the kingdom of the Israelites, which was exiled, and then we have up north these empires that constantly are changing, right? So we had Ashur, we had beforehand other nations, but Ashur was the first empire, and now we have
a little closer.
Now we have Babylon. Eventually we'll also have the Persians. So it's a question of what will happen in the north that'll be the dramatic change for the way, or the case that Am Yisrael could actually survive and stay independent in their own land. So I was saying until 605, there was really no case for Yirmiyahu against all the false prophets, meaning things were as usual, and there was no reason to think that he's a true prophet and they're the false prophets. It could have been the other way around. Now coming to Yirmiyahu, this date is mentioned, I think, 4 times in the book of Yirmiyahu, and it's a very, very important turning point because it's the year, I think, that Yirmiyahu kind of says, okay, now you're going to see events that are changing across your eyes, and you're going to see that you're going to go out, start counting. And I'll remind you, there's another prophecy that says that the return of Am Yisrael to Eretz Yisrael after the first temple was destroyed will be Lemalot Melech Bavel 70 Shana, which will happen 70 years after the ruling of the Babylons. So when do we count 70 years from? We're counting 70 years from this battle from 605 until 538, Cyrus's declaration. Now, we know later, and I guess you'll reach another Haftorah, that the temple wasn't built right away and took another 20 years, and we might have ended up counting from the temples being destroyed, or at least maybe there was more than one option on the table. But this is a very important turning point. And this is a minute that Yirmiyahu really has to go around, I would say, from the bottom of his heart, telling them, be with me. You're looking at the changes now, and the whole situation is going to decline from this minute and on.
As you're speaking, honestly, I got a little bit of a chill because I wouldn't even say all the horrific events in the past 2 years that impacted Am Yisrael, but the regional changes that we've experienced, even I would say in the past year, right, since we were able in unbelievable, mini wars, battles, missions to be able to shift the regional powers in this area, it's not so dissimilar. Meaning in another 20, 30 years, we may look back at last year and be, that was a shift in Iran or that was a shift in Hezbollah, right? This happens all the time. And I just want to sort of bring in that comparison so that it really brings that to life, that this happened in the ancient world and it also is happening now. So for the case of Yirmiyahu, now we have Egypt defeated, which was a big surprise, and now we have the rise of Bavel. And I just remind everyone that Israel is always the corridor, meaning we're not so important, but we connect the big regional powers. And so, they've already gotten rid of the northern kingdom, and now it's just Judea, and we're sort of, I would say, the thorn in the side of. And so that's why we always have to figure out alliances with our bigger powers, and they, in theory, also want to have relations with us, not because we were so critical, but because we were a critical pass to get to Egypt and again, for all those big powers to reach each other. In terms of the actual content of this prophecy, I'm curious, what are maybe some of the images that stand out, or in this plea, as you described it, for Yirmiyahu, in this plea by Yirmiyahu to have the people understand the importance of this moment, what is it that he wants them to notice? What comes through in this prophecy?
Well, first I would say very clearly that הדבר אשר דיבר השם אל ירמיהו הנביא, as usual, we're emphasizing Yirmiyahu is the true prophet. Yeah. Every word here is important. לבוא נבוכדנצר מלך בבל להכות את ארץ מצרים. This will be the turning point from, as I said, from the year 605, where Nebuchadnezzar is going to succeed and he's going to win the battle in Karkamish. So that's why this is very important. So, לבוא נבוכדנצר מלך בבל להכות את ארץ מצרים. His victory in this year, in 605, is really what's going to make Babylon the next empire for the next 30, 65, 70 years. So this is like the minute we're looking at the empire being institutionalized. So in the verses that are right before our Haftorah, which are not part of the Haftorah, but they come right before, I would look for a minute at the way Egypt is preparing for war, which I think the prophet, kind of takes that as obvious when we read the Haftorah. But I want to look at them for a second. We have here descriptions, a detailed description of how every single detail in the Egyptians being prepared for war is glorious, is magnificent. Isru Susim, right? These are the horses that, because of that, we're not supposed to have many horses because we're not supposed to go back to Egypt. It's part of the Egyptian categorization. Ve'alu parashim, v'yatyatzvu bekovanim. You should now go up on your horses, and you should have every single detail of your...
See their helmets and their armor and all the detail of how they prepared. It reminds me a little bit of like Goliath in the description of all the armor of Goliath.
But it also explains to you why people were looking at Yirmiyahu and saying, what are you talking about? No one's defeated Egypt in the past. Yeah. And look how prepared they are, well prepared. And just to understand this, if you're coming from Babylon and you're going to reach until Karkamish, you still, even though you didn't reach until Egypt, you're pretty far away from your central city, and you're bringing a whole lot of troops and you're trying to win this battle, it looks totally irrelevant. Meaning it looks like this nation that's been around forever, that even though it was all the way in the south, no one ever succeeded reaching until her. When it's very, very well prepared, it won't be in any way conquered. And then comes the verses of our Haftorah. And when we come to our Haftorah, we come to saying, why actually did they fall? What happened here? They were well prepared. They were never conquered. They succeeded against all odds time after time. And here comes a clear answer of the prophet. It happened, ki Hashem hadafo. God decided that Egypt will now be defeated. It was not because we're looking at who's better and who's worse. What we're looking at is God, the Babylonian king, as God's long right hand here in the area. And I want to say something about that I think is important. When we look at who destroyed the temple, we're not looking at this huge Assyrian empire that succeeded destroying all other temples. We're looking at an empire that did so little in the ancient Near Eastern world that was
Babylon
around
specifically.
We're looking at an empire that has less than 70 years on wall, that has no other major successes to their name, that in any rational way, there was no reason they could come against the Jewish temple that was survived, even Sennacherib and all the Assyrian kings, time after time. And even the Persian Empire was much stronger. And that wasn't the empire that defeated the Jerusalem temple either. And this prophecy, I think, emphasizes what we're talking about. In a nutshell, we're talking about something that makes a clear description of the fact that this could have only happened because God was involved here. Because in any rational manner, this was not the empire that you would expect to succeed burning down the temple. And not only that, they succeed in burning down the temple. If 605 is just 20 years before the temple is destroyed. If you're thinking about the ancient Near Eastern world, it takes an empire at least a decade to kind of build their powers, settle in. It takes many decades until they're capable of going far away from their center and conquering nations on enlarging their empire. And here comes an empire 20 years after they've 20 years after they established their existence around here. They already burned down the temple. They're already after a sage. They're already after exiling the people in 597, which is like right around the corner. And then it takes them another 2 or 3 decades and they're gone.
Right.
So we really have this strong sense of Ki Hashem Hadafo, that this happened because God decided it was the time for the Jewish temple to be destroyed, and it had to do with God's decision. And
I just want to butt in for one moment, because in this prophecy, you're saying that the improbability is that Egypt, who was always so secure, would fail in this battle. And that improbability, you're saying, paves the way for the improbability of Bavel being the ones who are going to conquer Israel. Meaning there are two different. One is Egypt, the strong Egypt, being defeated. And in the case of Bavel, it's the Bavel who is not our, again, I'm going to say, think about our weaker enemies around us who've managed to do something very, very powerful. Similar idea. They weren't the ones you would think would succeed, but in the end, they are the ones that would succeed. And the prophet comes to say, yeah, well, that's because God helped them, right? That's because God wanted this because of, our sins, etc.
Right. And that's why I think, again, it's repeated in the prophecy. Chai ani neum hamelech Hashem tzvaot shmo. Meaning, I want to emphasize in this prophecy the verses that seem obvious. But there, I think what was not obvious, if you were looking in a rational manner in how the world is being ruled now by different empires. And within that situation, where all the nations are looking around, and actually also Am Yisrael is looking around, and they're saying, is God, our God, capable? Is he going to still be capable after his temple is destroyed? Is he capable even though he enables his people to be exiled? And that's what Yirmiyahu is emphasizing here in this prophecy. He's saying, on the one hand, yes, it's Egypt that will fall, and it's a Babylonian king that will succeed, but it's again me. Amar Hashem tzvaot Elohei Yisrael, hineni poked el Amon mibno. Meaning, it's God who knows very well the Egyptian god Amon, who comes from the city of No. And ani poked oto, I am telling him, and now he's going to say that he's going to lose this battle, that he won't succeed. ועל פרעה ועל מצרים ועל אלוהיה ועל מלכיה ועל פרעה ועל הבוטחים בה. This is a real question of who rules the world. And this question is, does it happen to be Babylonia that happened to be stronger than Egypt in this round? And Yirmiyahu is replying to that. And he's saying, no, it's Hashem who's deciding who's going to win, who's going to lose. This battle, Paro, who we thought would succeed, is going to lose. And it's their God who will be defeated. And the reason is because our God, Hashem, decided that the Babylonians will be the ones that will end up destroying Jerusalem's temple, which is right around the corner. So that's why I said at the beginning that it looks like a prophet to the Mitzrayim, but it's not a prophet to Mitzrayim.
Yeah.
It's not a prophet to Egypt at all. It's a prophet where Yirmiyahu is debating with the people or against the people's fundamental assumptions who's ruling the world and what's going to happen around the corner. And the way to present that is to make very clear that everything happening to Egypt is happening because Hashem is the one making the decisions here, and he decided it's the time they fall. And I also want to say that's not a message I think that matters to the Egyptians, meaning they fell. They're not going to ask now, is it the Babylonians or the Israel's God? They're going to ask, where's their God?
Right.
But Israel's going to ask, who's ruling here? Is it the Babylonian God, Marduk, that became stronger now?
Yeah.
Is this Ammon, the God of Egypt, that became stronger now? Or does our God have totally different assumptions that are totally different than anything known in the ancient Near Eastern world, where a strong God doesn't necessarily have to be representative by a strong temple or strong nation? Because only our God has this ability to destroy his temple, exile his people, and then still make sure they live for 2,000 years.
I just want to connect it back to the Parsha for a moment, because I think some of these connections are obvious, but when we read this week's Parasha, we really have the total downfall of the Egyptian empire. Okay, that's an overt connection between it. But I think the deeper part, based on what you're saying, is both because we know that the underpinnings of the 10 Makot were sort of these battle of the gods, and in this week's Parasha, with the death of the firstborns, we kind of have the final vanquishing of many of these ideas of the Egyptian pantheon. But you also have the same idea you said before, which is that there was no logical reason why this little, fairly weak, enslaved people should be able to bring upon this mighty, dynasty and the ancient Egyptian world. There was no logical reason why we should have been able to create any havoc in their kingdom. And so it's in the opposite direction, obviously, right? Meaning there that we were successful, as opposed to here, where Egypt is being destroyed in order for the Babylonians to then come and rise to power. But it's the same, I would say, the same turning point, right? At least the way the Torah is presenting it, with the exact same turning point, where there, vis-a-vis that the Egyptians are sort of inching their way towards a fall of their ancient empire, and we're moving towards our future of Am Yisrael. Now, we are not imperialistic in that way, so our future doesn't look like, and now we became a big power. We're always just trying to survive, it seems. So we leave Egypt to then really struggle to survive in the desert. It's a different structure of how Am Yisrael functions, and again, Sham in Jewish history. But I think that's a really important piece I want to take in the connection you're creating between the Haftorah and the Parsha. Is this turning point.
Maybe I'll add, and I'll say, we have this clear voice in the parashot of Hashem yilachem lachem ve'atem tacharishun.
Yeah.
Meaning
God will fight for you, and we just hang tight.
Don't do anything. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing here in this parsha. And that's why I said I think it's so central about who's making the decisions and who's fighting this war. And I would also say it's even stronger because Hashem's also saying that about Noamon. He's also saying even the Egyptians aren't really fighting here. Really, no one's really fighting here, not in the Haftarah and not in the Parsha. And I think that's a very strong connection, especially when they're both dealing with Egypt. And the other thing I would say is, in Shmot we have Uvechol Elohei Mitzrayim Eiseh Shvatim, right? God's going to come against all of the Egyptian gods. And I think that's also clear in this Haftarah, meaning, bottom line, Hashem saying, it seems like Ammon had his glorious days. Well, they're over. Eventually, here's V'choles Eloi Mitzrayim Eiseh Shvatim. Their day's coming now, too. Babylonians are not only my messengers for Am Yisrael, and they're not only going to make sure around the corner, unfortunately, that the temple will be destroyed on my behalf, but they're also going to punish all the Egyptian gods for what they deserve, which is not our story. By the way, that doesn't show up in this chapter. Meaning, I don't know what God's story was with the Egyptian gods in this specific chapter.
Yeah.
What I do know is, and that'll connect you to Ezekiel's last week of Torah, that for Am Yisrael, a nation that survived against all odds when all other temples were falling, is a theological question. And there God's answer is wait. you have to be patient. This doesn't all happen at once. So
I think also just to end with this piece that you mentioned before, that Yechezkel is speaking from a very different vantage point. He didn't experience the exile, and he's speaking, already in Bavel and to a different population. And I think that often, I was just thinking that, you can ask theological questions when you have distance from an event. It takes a little bit of perspective, a little bit of distance, a little bit even of just not being in the thick of things. But when you're in the thick of things, you have to deal with the immediate turning points around you. And I think that that's also, again, I don't want to overgeneralize Yirmiyahu as being in the immediate and Yechezkel as being, theological, because obviously they both have a mix of each of them. So that wouldn't be fair to describe them as that. But I think that piece is significant, meaning Yirmiyahu has to look at the events around him and say, how do we interpret this? How are we looking at this right now? And Yechezkel has the privilege, or he has the ability to be a little bit afar and look at things differently. And I think that's
I'll add on to that, and I'll say that Egypt did do a lot of bad doings to Yehuda also in the current events, meaning they did, kill Yoshiao right in the battle next to Megiddo, and that's a story, again, we understand that happened on behalf of God, but that definitely deserves some kind of revenge against Egypt specifically. And maybe this is part of it. And also, Paro Necho, who takes Yoachaz down to Egypt and puts Yoakim on. We have a concrete history with the Egyptians in Yirmiyahu's days that I think wants to kind of unfold and see what happens too. So this is a very concrete response also to the concrete bad things that Egypt are doing to Am Yisrael in these years. But what I would say is that it's only part of the story. And it's true also about Yechezkel, meaning Yechezkel is looking around in this world in a very concrete situation where the Babylonians basically succeeded conquering the whole world after the Assyrians succeeded in conquering anyone they didn't, and only in Sidon and Mitzrayim are surviving. And that's a theological question that he has to cope with in his days. And it's not only about will the temple be rebuilt and when and by whom. I would say one other closing message, which is finally Yirmiyahu's exiled to Egypt. And what we know from extra biblical sources that are around these years, some people say 610, 605, a Jewish community was institutionalized in Mitzrayim that actually had a temple of their own, Mikdash Yev. So Yirmiyahu was exiled to Egypt, and there's a community there by the time he's coming there. And they have an alternative temple to Jerusalem's temple. We know that because we have letters and communications. And I think that he actually has a moment, that's how I imagine Yirmiyahu, of peace, meaning the end of the story is that Jewish communities are around the world. There's diaspora Jewry. It wasn't the end of the Jewish nation. Some of them will come back to Israel, but others will stick around in diaspora until today. And he really is there saying how the Jewish nation kind of modifies itself and transforms itself to an existence in a different way that I think he couldn't anticipate when he was looking at the temple being burnt. So the way I see it, even though he couldn't imagine, and he was so angry about the Havamina, the idea that Jews would go down to Egypt, I imagine myself at the end of his life kind of saying, okay, something's happening, the roots are being planted, and something will change and not be the way maybe I was hoping for it to end, but there'll be Jewish communities, there'll be vibrant Jewish communities around the world, and this is a beginning. There's a closure to Yirmiyahu in Mitzrayim that I think maybe gave him some comfort.
Dr. Tova Ganzel, thank you so much for being here. Really, really appreciate your insights broadly into Nevi'im and specifically into this week's Haftorah.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.